Hello guys, and welcome back to Joe's Ventures. And today we're doing episode 80 of our Jurassic World Evolution 2 mod spotlights, where we take a look at some of the wonderful mods people have been making and compare them to their real life fossil counterparts. So I know it's been a little while, but getting stuck into it, life happenings, full time job, all that good stuff. But yep. Anyway, we're going to be starting off with a cool pack that Trippy has made. So Trippy's28 has made a new pack with animals from Africa. So quite excited to get stuck in this one. We're going to be starting off with a cool mammal. We've got Arsinoitherium. There's a very interesting animal here. You can see the Arsinoitherium. Interesting spots here and there. So this is Arsinoitherium. Was an extinct genus of panungulate mammal that belongs to the extinct order Erythropoda. And is, even though it looks very much like a rhinoceros, it's actually more closely related to hyraxes, elephants, and dugongs and manatees. So it is a member of the Aphrotheres. It's Paeungulata. Those animals. So they're very superficially rhino-like, and they lived from the late Eocene to the early Oligocene. So between 36 to 27 million years ago, around that time, in North Africa, and in areas of tropical rainforest and the margins of mangrove swamps. And there's about two species described. The one that we mostly see is Zalethi, and then Giganteum was described in 2004, not 2020. So the best known species is A. Zalethi, and then there was another species, A. Giganteum, that was described from Ethiopia in 2003. The fossil teeth are far larger than Zalethi, so that means they would have been bigger. The generic name Arsinoitherium actually comes from the pharaoh Arsinoe which is actually where near the fossil's been found, and therium means beast, and the species name Zetheti comes to honor the German paleontologist Karl Alfred Ritter von Zittel, who actually pioneered a lot of paleontology in Egypt, so it's a name to honor him. So adults of the species Azalethi got about 1.75 or about 5 feet 7 feet tall, 5.7 feet tall at the shoulders, and about 3 meters or just under 10 feet long. And they measure about 2.5 tons, so they're a bit smaller than your modern white rhino, but still pretty large animals. And you can see they've got very similar kind of features. They were commonly thought to be an extinct rhino species, but actually were found to be more closely related to elephants and manatees. Looking at their anatomy, like they've got feet very much more similar to elephants and then other ungulates, like especially the perissodactyls. Very large, slow-moving animals. They would have had forelimbs adapted for pulling strongly backwards and forwards, which is actually typical of animals that punt themselves through water, so kind of similar to hippos. And the fossils have been found in sediments of like water, humid, coastal swamps, like lowland forests and things like that. So that's where they've kind of been found. But the most notable features, you can see they've got those quite large horns, with a little bit of smaller one there. And they're actually thought to be more similar to bovid horns and like with the keratin horns of rhinos. So thought to be more like ossicones. Originally they were thought to be, these are similar to modern bovids. While early reconstructions usually saw them like ossicones, like giraffes, they actually would have had a layer of keratin on them, which is pretty interesting. And both male and females have horns, with some investigators actually finding a larger and smaller species at the same site. That is thought to be, sexual dimorphism. And they've got very robust skeletal columnar legs that are more elephant-like legs as well. And they actually do have a full component of 44 teeth, which is the primitive state for placental mammal dentition as well. However, they have quite a unique way of chewing and shifting their jaw joint to have constant pressure to the row of teeth, which is quite cool, and they would have been likely a quite selective browser. So as I mentioned, their habitat range from all sorts of parts of northern Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, Angola, Egypt, Oman, Libya, and Tunisia, places like that. So yeah, very, very interesting animal. Definitely a cool one to cover. So we're going to be moving on from our, Arsinoitherium. We've got a next animal from Trippy's pack. We've got Beelzebufo. Very, very cool one. Here's our Beelzebufo. Very, very cool. Well, let me just quickly check. Look at this cute little guy here. Look at you. No, nah, I like this one. This one's calling out to me. So this is Beelzebufo, which is a particularly large species of prehistoric frog that was described in 2008, and it's also called the devil frog, devil toad, or frog from hell. So the first fossil bones were found in 2008 by David W. Krause from the New York's Stony Brook University, but it took 14 years for scientists Susan E. Evans, Mark E. H. Jones, and Krause to establish enough data to publish it. And they gave the generic name Beelzebufo for the postman to Beelzebub, which is the deity that's like Lord of the Flies, kind of considered the alter ego of the Christian devil. And Bufo, which means toad, and then its specific name means imago, which means shield, so it's basically the devil toad shield, or devil frog shield. And there's been about 100 or so isolated partial bones found. Some are articulate, and some include bone case, but there's a little bit there as well. And they've been able to reconstruct the skeleton quite well, so we have a pretty good idea of what it looks like. So in earlier studies, it was estimated to be much larger. There were snout to vent lengths, or from the tip of the snout to their cloaca, that suggests to be about 42.5 centimeters, or about 16.7 inches. But in later studies, animals, the estimates have gone to at least about 23.2 centimeters, which is about the same size of an African bullfrog. So still huge, but not as stupidly huge as they were. And they've got very big heads, and the skull roof actually shows lots of rugose external surface, which suggests that the head may have been covered in bony scales or scutes. And the skull structure is open in even the largest specimens. The sutures are open in even the largest specimens of Beelzebufo, which showed that they might have grown bigger. So there is hope that they would have been a little bit bigger. So yeah, still really cool frog. In terms of their paleobiology, they were most likely a predator with these large mouths that would be eating large prey, like modern bullfrogs, or even modern frogs. They'll just eat whatever they can get their mouths around, especially bullfrogs. And this was likely as well mean they could eat potentially small dinosaurs, the juvenile dinosaurs. Bite force measurements from the Carwell's horn frog suggest that the bite force of a large Beelzebufo, with a skull width about 15 centimeters, 6 inches, had a bite force between 500 and 2,200 newtons, between 110 to 490 pounds. So quite a strong bite for such a big guy. So in terms of paleobiology, they are from Madagascar. So if you guys seen Prehistoric Planet, where a lot of this is based off, they would have been found with animals like Nundasuchus, Nundasuchus, and all sorts of really cool animals. At this time, it would have been still attached to India, and these guys are potentially, they resemble the most of horned frogs, which are a South American group of frogs, which raise the possibility that they've got a Gondwanian origin, which is quite interesting. That there is evidence that there could be convergence, so they might have just evolved similar traits because they were doing similar things. But yeah, most likely they evolved from those kind of frogs, which is quite cool. And then a study in 2018 kind of looked at these traits and thought they were more ancient groups, distantly related to horned frogs. But there was another study that showed that Nundasuchus and Beelzebufo are sister genus, and then they're clade in the extant group Tethydraco, which suggests these guys are kind of a stem group to them. But yeah, they are still living relatives of these guys around today, and really, really cute. How can you not love these wonderful froggies? How can you not love a good frog? I'm definitely in love. Look at this cool guy. He's a friend. How awesome. Love the colors on this guy as well. Really fits well. Nice to see even the Prehistoric Planet design really goes hard on these guys. So yeah, really, really cool. Next up, we've got another one. Next up, we've got Nundasuchus, which is another really cool one by Trippy. So let's see who's... Ooh, perfect angle for this guy. So this is Nundasuchus. So these guys are an extinct genus of Cudosaurian or Suchian archosaurs. So they're archosaur a little bit more closely related to crocodiles, related to Pancrocodilomorpha. And this is found in Middle Triassic beds, so about between 247 to 242 million years ago, in Tanzania with the single species Nundasuchus songenensis, known from a single partial complete skeleton that includes vertebrae, limb elements, osteoderms, and fragments, things like that. So it's known solely from the holotype, which was now housed in the National Museum of Tanzania and is quite complete. And it would have lived with an isolated outcrop, which is found with like other archosaurs and Rhengocephalians, Rheancosaurs, a lot of really interesting animals that have been found with it. Very interesting skull. So the skull material is only limited to the right jaw, and they seem to be typical of most carnivorous archosaurs, so nothing too interesting there. Very interesting osteoderms, kind of similar to those of Vanaclava, which is a very interesting archosaur, which is interesting. Quite cool. So it was first named and described by Sterling J. Nesbitt, Christian A. Seedor, and Kenneth D. Auskutek, or some name. And the type species is Nundasuchus songenensis, with the generic name coming from Swahili language, which Nuda means predator, and Suchus being Greek for crocodile. And the new specific name comes from Songia, which is a location near the area, so Enensis, so it's from, Sonenka. And in terms of its relationship, the original description suggests these guys would have been quite late. They would suggest they were a pseudosaucian, but more an archosaur, more closely related to crocodiles and dinosaurs, and suggest them quite a basal suchosaucian. Some others looked into well, suggesting they may be rarasaucians, and then replace it with the clade Paracrocodilomorpha to kind of include these guys. And there's kind of a few traits. So Nundasuchus is kind of just outside Ahetosaurs, and Sucha, so just outside of them, which is quite interesting. Yeah, lots of taxonomy. It's one of those things. A lot of these early kind of crocodilians, they're so not only partial, but they're just, a lot of them have figured out in the tree. It's taxonomy being taxonomy. It's really hard to figure out just from bones alone. But yeah, really, really cool. Nice to see some underrated animals getting some love. So let you run off and do your thing. We'll have to let these guys run off a bit because we've got a big animal. So now we will carry on. So this is Rebbachisaurus, which is quite cool. Pretty colors on this guy. So let's have a look at you. A wonderful big guy. So Rebbachisaurus, or out Rebecca lizard, these are a genus of, or Rebbachisaurus is actually the better way to say it, Rebbachi. Is a genus of sauropod dinosaur from Diplodocidae, so it's a member of Diplodocus. Lived in the late Cretaceous of Africa and potentially in South America, as we'll get into, around 99 to 97 million years ago, which is quite interesting. So the remains attributed to Rebbachisaurus have been found in Morocco, Nigeria, Algeria, and potentially Tunisia and Argentina. So Argentina is Brachiosaurus, can be considered the same, although only the Moroccan remains can be considered doubt. And there's Rarasaurus, which is basically the South American equivalent. It's nearly identical anyway, so they may have been the same animal, and suggests there may be a connection between South America and Africa during the late Cretaceous, or the early Cretaceous, which is quite cool. So between the 8th of October 1948 and 3rd of January 1952, Ray Lavkart kind of collected this kind of large, specimen of the holotype, which has a few ribs and things like that. And he named the type specimen Rebbachisaurus gabesi, which is during the same year, but it was only a shoulder blade, and then kind of undescribed and all the new stuff. And there was actually a second specimen with a partial vertebrae that measured up to about 1.45 meters, which is quite interesting. There was also the second one, as I mentioned, described in 1960. That was in Sahara as well. A third species was also described in 1995 in Argentina, which was actually found near the holotype of Giganotosaurus, and then it was discovered, and then it was moved to the genus Lemursaurus. And then another one was kind of considered the same thing. Rheosaurus was described and then considered synonymous. So it's a very interesting history. So it's definitely an animal on the bigger side. It's estimated that Rebbachisaurus was about 14 meters or about 46 feet long and weighed about 7 tons, though some have given it bigger estimates up to 26 meters and 40 tons. And like other relatives, other Rebbachisaurids, very interesting group that includes like Nigersaurus and all sorts of really cool late surviving diplodocids. They would have a small head, long neck, and a whip-like tail. And the way they could be distinguished from other sauropods is the tall ridges on their back, and you can see that kind of the ridge in the spine going on there as well, which is quite interesting. So in terms of its relationships, it is, as I mentioned, it was considered a basal Rebbachisaurus, but has been actually placed in their own group, like Lomaosaurus. So it has been placed in the group within that group. So there's kind of Rebbachisaurus, basal ones, things like Amazonosaurus, things like that. Then there's Lemursaurus, which includes Rebbachisaurus and Limosaurus and Ramosaurus, and then Nigersaurine, which is the family that includes Nigersaurus and things like that, and its relatives, which is quite cool. So it's a very interesting animal. There's been lots of animals actually found around, like large coelacanths, like Mastona. Very interesting, rich habitats. Lots of crocodilians. Other dinosaurs have been found, but there's like a Carodontosaurus and Sauronops, which I covered last time. Spinosaurs, like Deltadromeus, and Spinosaurus itself, and Silurosaurus, Deltadromeus. And yeah, just your typical Cretaceous environment around that time. So yeah, very interesting animal. I like that it got a bit of a wider head. So a lot of the relatives got a wider head. Really makes it a little bit more distinct. So yeah, definitely a big fan. Really, really awesome. So I'm gonna let you run off and do your thing. So next up, we're going to have a look at the water. So we're going to do extra ones. We've got a really cool little guy. This was one I wanted to cover for a while. We have got Hybodus. So let's open up Hybodus. He's a cool guy here, so let him swim off and... Oh, no, we'll have a look at you. Since you're already in a good spot. Pretty. So this is Hybodus. So Hybodus means crooked tooth or crooked tooth. An extinct genus of hybotid shark, which is the group they live in, that lived about the middle Jurassic to the early Cretaceous, so quite a long-lived. Species closely related to type species Hybodus reticulus lived during the early Jurassic, and there's been not many species described as Hybodus that can cover quite a large space of time. So it was actually considered currently considered a waste basket taxon. So that means they just throw a lot of species in there, because it looks like Hybodus. It's not something that's actually been really sorted out yet, and is broadly polyphyletic. So that means there's a lot of lineages that aren't related to each other in the same genus, when it requires a good re-examination. So Hybodus typically grew to about 2 meters or about 6'6", but there's larger specimens that get up to about 3 meters. You can see they've got quite this streamlined body like modern sharks, with 2 similar-sized dorsal fins that helps them steer, and like other hybodontids, they had dentarous fish spines. You can see the spines there are present. And the fin spines of Hybodus were like a rib-like ornamentation, and they're like hooked tentacles as well, which is quite cool. And they had quite varied dentition that allowed them to eat a lot of varied food sources. Sharper teeth used them to catch prey, while flatter tooth would have been used for crushing. The males also possess claspers like modern sharks, so these are organs they would use to insert sperm in the female. And it's still present, as I mentioned, in modern sharks. So there's been several species described, but they've later been redescribed and added into different species, considered junior synonyms, or split into other groups as well, named into new genera. So typically, the only species around is Hybodus reticulus and H. havmanus, which is the larger 3-meter one. And they're thought to be an active predator, so swimming around very much like modern sharks. And there's also a preserved specimen of Hybodus hafenanus, which has numerous belemnites rostrums in its stomach, which actually could have resulted in its death. But yeah, typically these guys, pretty samey considering. But still quite cool. Love these guys. Definitely quite awesome. Nice mod here. So now we're going to let them swim off and do their thing. Next up, we have got Tethydraco. So this is a really cool one. Tethydraco. So this is Tethydraco. I'll have a look at you here because that's probably the best way I'm going to get a good look at you. So Tethydraco is a genus of pterodactylid pterosaur that lived during the late Cretaceous and around the Maastrichtian, which is now in Morocco about 66 million years ago. So it was originally assigned to the family Pteranodontidae, though there has been some evidence that may be an extarchid and potentially the same thing as Phosphatidraco, but that is disputed, so it could be go either way. And the type and only specimen is Regalis, Tethydraco regalis. So since 2015, there have been a group of paleontologists acquiring a lot of fossils from commercial Moroccan traders who'd been working around the phosphorus mines of the Cordoba Plateau, which comes from the latest Cretaceous. And the purpose of this project has been to really look at the diversity of pterosaurs in late Cretaceous. So a lot of the kind of a meme that went on historically that there was a lot of the pterosaurs kind of died out near the end of the Cretaceous to give way to birds, but these are like right at the end of the Cretaceous. So prehistoric planet was set 66 million years ago, so a lot of these guys were found 66 million years ago. So that shows that there was a lot more pterosaurs. They were doing pretty much fine right up until the extinction, which is quite cool. And they named the species in 2018 by Nicholas D. Longrich, Daniel Midatel, and Brian Andes, named them Tethydraco regalis. So Tethys is the Tethys Ocean, which separated Africa to Europe and Asia, which is that kind of, was around there. And Dragon, Draco, and Royal is regalis. The holotype is from the lowest phosphate, and dates to the late Maastrichtian. It contains a left humerus, and the bone is relatively crushed, and there's like some other specimens that are referred to, like the ulnar, thigh bone, things like that. And they suggest, looking at the anatomy, suggest it as I mentioned, a pterodactyloid. So it has a wingspan about 5 meters, or about 16 feet, and is believed to have a mass of about 15 kilograms. And this describing authors, they mentioned a few traits on it that actually distinguish it from all of other pterodontids, which is quite cool. They were placed, as I mentioned, in the family of Pteranodontidae, when this would actually make them the youngest member of their family, since these guys were around 66 million years ago, which is proof that the pterosaurs didn't go extinct at the end of before the end of the Cretaceous. They were doing quite well. And as I mentioned, there has been some research looking into them. They are suggested to be quite closely related to, Pteranodon itself and things like Geosternbergia. And then in 2020, there was some wing from this deposit was actually found. However, it actually suggests that Tethydraco was an astarchid rather than pterodactylid, and they actually possibly represented wing elements of Phosphatidraco, but it's kind of considered, something that's kind of been disputed now, which is quite interesting. And then it was discovered around this area, and there was lots of different pterosaurs that lived with, like Barbadactylus, which is already in the game, Alicone, and the Albertosaur Dinosaurus. So yeah, very interesting habitat, animal itself. So yeah, really, really cool to get a look at all these guys. Very similar to Pteranodon, but it's nice to know that Pteranodontids and pterosaurs didn't die out for whatever reason near the end of the Cretaceous. They were doing quite well right up to the end, until the big meteor killed everyone. So yeah, that's the best way to put it. Okay, so we'll let you run off and do your thing. So next up, we got Hockowl1215. So all those other mods are done by Trippy. This one's Hockowl1215. We have got 3 different species of Brontosaurus. So I've talked about Brontosaurus before. I'll just go through the different species. I don't think I've actually talked about it, but it's very similar in most ways to Brontosaurus, Apatosaurus. So we'll go through and have a look at the different species. And look at Hockowl, he always delivers. So Brontosaurus has a very interesting history. So, Brontosaurus, which means thunder lizard, is a large sauropod that came from the United States, lived during the late Jurassic. So, it was first described by American paleontologist Othniel Charles Marsh in 1879, and then the type species being dubbed Brontosaurus excelsus, which is this one here, based on a partial skeleton found in Wyoming. There were a couple other species found, and they both lived between 156 to 146 million years ago during the Cambrian and Tithonian in the Morrison, so in Utah, Wyoming. And then for decades, how everyone referred to as Patasaurus as Brontosaurus, and people would, and paleonerds would be like, no, actually, Apatosaurus was described first, so it's not Brontosaurus, and they would consider the same thing. But that was right until 2015, where Emmanuel Tashop actually found it to be distinct, and so it's kind of one thing that's come back. Brontosaurus, so you can't be that nitpicky. So now Brontosaurus is now an actual genus again with 3 different species, which is quite interesting. So it was first also described with not a proper skull. It was considered a lot more Chimaerosaurid skull, but then it was found to have much more diplodocid skull as its relatives. But yeah, we'll get into the species. So this is the Brontosaurus excelsus. So this was first described by Marsh in 1879, with many specimens being found of the species, with the specimen that's mounted in the Field Museum of Natural History, which has just been found to be an unknown species. And then some had been, lumped into them as well. They've got a very complicated taxonomic history. So the largest of these species estimated to specimens have been about 15 tons and up to about 22 meters, or about 72 feet from head to tail. And the known definitive B. excelsus fossils have been found around, bushy basin member in Wyoming, joined to Lake Cambrian, so about 152 million years ago. So yeah, a really, really cool animal. It is a diplodocid, so they are related to things like Apatosaurus, and they're split. There's the Apatosaurines, that includes Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus, and you have diplodocids, or like Diplodosaurine, which includes like Diplodocus and Supersaurus, and those kind of animals. So Barosaurus, another good example as well. Very, very interesting. Very similar to Apatosaurus as well. They've got much thicker necks, so they're a little bit thicker than, diplodocids. They're long. These guys have got very thick necks, potentially using them to fight each other as well. Very interesting taxonomy as well. So that's excelsus. And this is kind of not the oldest in terms of its time. This is the oldest in terms of being described. So this was the first species described, which is quite interesting. So we'll move on to the next species. So let's have a look at these colors for a bit. Really, really awesome. I love, Hockel always knocks it out of the park with these guys. Really, really awesome. So let you run off and do your thing. So this will be Brontosaurus parvus. Here's the wonderful parvus. So this was originally described of its own genus as Allosaurus in 1902 by Peterson and Gilmore, and it was reassigned to Apatosaurus in 1994, and then Brontosaurus in 2015. And specimens have been found, including the holotype, which is a partial skeleton of a juvenile, that's been found, and some other specimens found that date to about the Middle Cambrian, so it is younger, technically older than Parvus. And adult specimens have been estimated to weigh up to 14 tons and measure about 22 meters from head to tail. And there is some evidence, especially like Apatosaurines, did get quite big. These guys would have got quite big. There's not too much different. Most of the differences you'll see is mainly during time, but also the basically timing and some minor differences in the skeleton that tells you different species apart as well. Yeah, quite cool. These guys, we'll talk a little bit about like some of their physiology and stuff like that. So historically, a lot of these guys were thought to have heads that kind of went just straight from parallel to their body. But evidence suggests, because pretty much all vertebrates hold their neck at about a 45-degree angle, so it's very much likely that sauropods would have done that as well. So even these guys, you can see, hold their neck quite high, even though they would have been most likely browsers. There are some sort of estimates as well that differences in ecology with these guys. These guys could have been potentially a bit more foresty animals, so lived in forests, being thicker, being able to push through the undergrowth more, while diplodocids would have been living in more open areas as well. And really cool as well, these guys, using their large size, would have been easy for them to maintain, body temperature, but these also found that they would have had much more avian-like breathing, so they would have the air sacs, which allowed them to both take in more oxygen, but also potentially better regulate their body temperature, which is quite cool. And they've got that very long tail, which is something a lot of diplodocids have. So diplodocids would have potentially used that. There's estimates, where they've been able to create whip-like sounds, potential to a cannon, things like that, but it's not quite described. And as I mentioned as well, these got quite robust necks that potentially could have had spikes or bosses on things like that, where they would have been used to kind of fight each other. And very similar to things like giraffes and tortoises, they would have had these thick necks and potentially fought each other like that, which is always quite interesting. And a little bit of their growing up as well. We actually have a pretty good idea of their how they grew. So there's been estimates of their requirements. They would have believed to fed on like ferns, cycads, and seed ferns and things like that, and a ground height. And they would have had quite a high teeth replacement rate, so they would have replaced them quite often, so they were just producing lots and lots of teeth. And as I mentioned, they would have been potentially consuming tougher vegetation than animals like Diplodocus. That allows them to niche partition, so be able to feed on different foods. And being endotherms and ectotherms, that means depending on what they would be eating, how much food they'll need. Estimates of the dietary needs of Brontosaurus may have been made in 2010, and led to the hypothesis that were depending on whether it was an ectotherm and endotherm. So if they were endotherm, there would have been fewer adult individuals that can be sustained because they need more food. And during this, these guys would have, it's also been theorized, these would have lived in arid environments, so needing a lot of, food to, keep up with themselves. And it's estimated they would have needed to consume about 262 liters of water, depending on their metabolism, and their stomachs would have had about 5 tons of fermenting contents, throughout their lives. And then, being like potentially ruminating, they would need constantly food in their stomach to kind of break down and things like that, which is quite cool. Another cool thing, we'll talk about how they grew. So there was actually studies looking at Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus and seeing how they grew. In 2008, there was another study looking at the growth. So they would have believed to have reached about 25 tons, or about 25 long tons, but 25 tons in 15 years, with peak about growing about 5 tons a year. So they were very fast growers. So an alternative method using, they would have grown about half a ton a year, about 520 kilograms, and reached their full kind of body mass at about 70 years old. And these have been considered reliable, but it's very interesting, to look at that. And funny, B. pravis is actually known from juvenile material as well, so that suggests these guys may have been a sign of immaturity and things as well. And there's lots of estimations that suggest that sauropods never really stop growing, so things like crocodiles, things like that, they never really stop growing when they become adults. It slows down a lot, but they never truly stop growing. So we never really have a maximum adult, really, which is quite interesting as well. But yeah, we can let the B. pravis kind of run off its doing its thing. And go on our next one still. So we'll have a look at our last species, and then we'll talk a little bit about other stuff about them. And then, kind of carry on. So we got here, this is the last species. So this is Brontosaurus johannepin. Man, I love the pattern on this one. Looks really, really nice. Let's just pause and get a good look at you. How can you not love this guy? I really do love the Hockal's Brontosaurus. It really is so awesome. Hockal just knocks all his mods out the park, so that's quite awesome. So this guy is actually the oldest species. So this is the first, oldest one found. It's known from a single site from the Lower Morrison in Wyoming, which is a site that Bertha Quarry in Albany County in Wyoming. Dates to about 155 million years ago, so it is the oldest. It grew up to about 21 meters, or about 69 centimeters. I mean, not millimeters. It's 21 meters, or 69 feet long. I don't know what's with my words today. It was described by James Fuller and Patrick Redman in 1994 as a species of Apatosaurus, but then it was mentioned in 2015 lumped into Brontosaurus, or moved into Brontosaurus. Its specific name comes from the Lakota Yakunapin, which means breast necklace, which refers to the pair of sternal ribs that would resemble the hairpieces traditionally worn by the tribe. And the holotype is actually a relatively complete postcranial skeleton, which is found in Lower Morrison, and there have been more fragmentary remains referred to this exact species. And there was a re-evaluation in 1998 by Robert T. Barker that found it to be more primitive, and that gave it the genus Eobrontosaurus, which means dawn brontosaurus, so an early brontosaurus. But likely, as I mentioned, it's just an earlier species of brontosaurus. It isn't considered the new genus. So we'll talk a little bit about their paleobiology. So, as I mentioned, they lived in the Morrison Formation, which is quite a famous formation. These guys would have potentially a semi-arid environment with wet and dry seasons. And it was quite a huge area, stretched from New Mexico to Alberta and Saskatchewan. And kind of was formed when the precursors of the Rocky Mountains kind of started to push up west. And this was a large habitat with lots of rivers and streams and a large drainage area, which is quite cool. It was thought that Brontosaurus may be more solitary than other formation dinosaurs, and as a genus they kind of existed for a long time and found in most levels, with B. excelsus being reported on for the Bruni Bush a little bit earlier, so we kind of have a good idea of where they lived. And then there, as I mentioned as well, the Morrison Formation is quite famous for having lots of animals, including things like Ceratosaurus, Apatosaurus, Allosaurus, Brachiosaurus, Camarasaurus, Camptosaurus, Diplodocus, Dryosaurus, animals like that. And it's also well known for lots of fishes, frogs, salamanders, turtles, sphenodonts, pterosaurs, bivalves, crocodilomorphs. Very rich and well-known ecosystem, which is quite cool. And in terms of popular culture, Brontosaurus has kind of become one of the most famous dinosaurs, up there with T-Rex. It's probably one of the top three, probably top five potentially. You think Tyrannosaurus, Triceratops, Stegosaurus, probably Brontosaurus is probably one of them. It's the most famous. And for a while, it was not considered a species, as I mentioned, but now it's considered one. So all those dinosaur nodes could be, it's actually a Apatosaurus. It's not a thing anymore. But it was first actually depicted in cinema in 1941 with Gertie the Dinosaur, which was considered a Apatosaurus, or Brontosaurus. Then was featured in King Kong in The Lost World in 1925 and 1953, and then lots of other things used it since, which is quite interesting. So very interesting that Apatosaurus, even though it's been used a little bit more than T-Rex, has got a very interesting history, and nice that it's back. So, and I'm gonna say Hockal, you always knock it out of the park. Really, really awesome mods here. You can see the really, really nice colours he gave them, and some of the changes. You can see they're not all quite the same. You can see some really nice colours and changes, things like that. It's really just knocked it out of the park as per always. Really, really awesome. So I'm gonna let you run off and do your thing. And we've got our last animal coming up. So this is by Hushquack Tree. We always love Hushquack Tree. So this is cosmetic for the Allosaurus. So this is another dubious taxon. So we call all about it. It's called Epanterias. So let's have a look at this guy. Let's have a look at you. And perfect roaring posture as well. So Epanterias is considered a dubious genus of theropod dinosaur from the Tithonian age, from the Morrison Formation as well, found in Garden Park, Colorado. It was described by Edward Drinker Cope in 1878, and the type species is Epanterias amplexus, and the genus is based on what is now AMNH 5767, which is parts of 3 vertebrae, a coracoid, a metatarsal, and although Cope originally thought it was a sauropod, it was later shown to be a theropod, and Gregorius Paul kind of looked at this material again and suggested to be a large species of Allosaurus in 1988, which he called as Allosaurus amplexus. Other authors have gone further, suggesting it's simply just a large Allosaurus fragilis. And in 2010, they kind of considered to come from a higher formation than type species and could potentially be a different taxon. But because the bones are not really diagnostic and we can't really tell much about what makes it distinct from other animals, is considered an open dubium. So it's the genetic or the generic epithet, which translates to buttressed in Greek, refers to the vertebrae, and amplexus refers to the copulary position in amphibians, where the male will clasp one of the females. So basically, the specific this full species name in English means clasping buttressed vertebrae, which is Epanterias amplexus in Latin. So yeah, really, really cool. Another great mod. A dubious genus, as I mentioned, but a nice, interesting design for an Allosaurus. Pretty much we consider it to be an Allosaurus, either a revert species or, kind of in the same boat as Saurophaganax. But yeah, really, really cool. I love the quills, love the spikes. A really, really awesome one. Definitely a really nice, kind of model there. So yeah, another nice one by Huck Hawktree. Trip and everyone and Hawk Owl, you all did a wonderful job. So I'll let you run off and do your thing now. So I think this is a great place to end the video. So I really, really, really hope you guys have enjoyed this video. Hope you guys like and subscribe. Always remember to get the little bell icon to get notified with anything. So yeah, if you guys enjoyed this video, hope you guys like and subscribe, and bye-bye.